So when we think about her death at the end of the story, we, the readers, believe that again, or we know that she is deeply saddened, shocked, and disappointed that her husband is alive, and now that her dreams of freedom and autonomy are sort of dashed to the ground, taken away from her in this final moment. Situational irony in the story also takes place, so we have a couple of levels of twists or situational irony that occurs. So one of them is the fact that Louise Mallard, who is on the surface a very conventional Victorian woman, and she reacts in a way that again defies the expectations of how a woman would normally react in this situation. A woman of this time period would react. So we see that she's defying the conventions of a angel in the house by actually reacting favorably to the news of her husband's death. And this would again be scandalous and controversial to read about a woman who would actually dare to feel or think anything other than sort of tragic thoughts following the death of her husband, and to dream of autonomy and freedom. These would be unheard of feelings for a woman of this time period. It's also somewhat situationally ironic that we begin reading the story and it's the husband who we believe is dead, and then Louise is the one who survives and will have a long life following this death. But then at the end of the story, we also get another twist where the husband returns alive and well, and it's Louise who ironically dies at the end of the story. There is also verbal irony in the final lines of the story. So once we get to the denouement and the doctor arrives and pronounces that Louise Mallard has died of the joy that kills, this statement is really sort of an important paradoxical phrase or wording that again we can sort of read into or infer multiple levels, multiple meanings to the joy that kills. So we can think of this as a paradox. So we usually don't have joy and death aligned within close proximity of one another. So these two things are again incompatible, but here we have the author putting them together. So immediately it draws our attention to the choice of words. So there are really two interpretations to how we can interpret the joy that kills. The first one is, again, how the doctor and Josephine and Richards and everyone believes the death occurred, which was that Louise Mallard was so overjoyed by the revelation that her husband was still alive, and this is what kills her. So they, again, believe the very conventional role that she would play as a happy housewife, and this is the overwhelming joy that she feels in this revelation that her husband is still alive. This is what takes her life. The second interpretation is, again, where we, the reader, have to sort of infer more from what we know about Louise Mallard. So we can see her joy as being the joy of freedom that she experienced earlier in the story while she was in her room, and having that joy taken away once her husband is revealed to be alive. This is sort of what we understand to be the moment her heart breaks, right? So the joy of her possible dreams of freedom are being taken away, and she suffers from a sort of symbolic heartbreak at this moment that she loses her freedom and is once again constrained by the shackles of an oppressive marriage. Chopin is also using a lot of sort of symbols and imagery to reinforce our understanding of Louise Mallard's feelings. And the most prominent one would be the presence of a heart or heart disease, heart trouble, and how that relates to the Mallard's marriage. So when we think about the heart and what it means culturally in terms of being a symbol, we automatically think of ideas of love or romance, fidelity, feelings, desires. I tend to think about sort of a Valentine's Day heart that you would give somebody as a sort of symbol of your love or affection for that person. So when we hear that Louise suffers from heart trouble, immediately it sort of we can sort of start thinking about what that heart trouble is really implying in terms of being a symbol for their relationship. So again, if Louise has heart trouble and the heart is the symbol of love, we can sort of infer or read into the idea that, well, she is stifling or oppressing her inner desires and her marriage is not a happy one. We also get symbolism or imagery when she retreats to her private room and she is sitting in her comfy armchair, facing an open window, staring out at the scene outside. And there's a lot of sort of imagery of new spring life at this moment. So this is at the bottom of page 52. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. So again, she's staring out the window and there's blue sky showing through the clouds, there's birds twittering away, there's someone singing in the background, and all the trees were aquiver with new spring life. So really we get a sense of optimistic imagery in this scene. She's facing this open window and perhaps she's sort of dreaming of the future, of the long years that will be hers and hers alone. So again, she is ready to live life for herself at this moment, now that she is free from her marriage and her husband, and she sees optimistically to the new life that is opening up in front of her. Another sort of key symbol is the goddess of victory. So this is how she reemerges from her room at the end of the story. So on page 54 of your Broadview anthology. She arose at length and opened the door to her sister's importunities. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. So she again emerges from her bedroom as sort of exuding a triumphant spirit in her eyes, and again she has this feeling of empowerment that just sort of is part of her state of being now. So she feels strong, powerful, and if we know anything about her, we knew before that she was very sort of frail, weak, had this heart trouble. So here we see an opposite depiction of Louise Mallard as someone who's strong, triumphant, empowered, and all this is taken away from her in that moment when Bentley Mallard walks through the door. Okay, so I'm eager to hear your feedback and your interpretations of this story. So I would again ask you to contribute to the discussion forum and answer some of the following questions. You can focus on one or more of the following questions. So what is your interpretation? What was the cause of Mrs. Mallard's death? Tell me what you thought or felt about the cause of her untimely death. And second question, what do the characters in the story believe caused Mrs. Mallard's death? What leads them to this conclusion? Third question, what do you as the reader know about Louise Mallard that the other characters do not? And then finally, how do you interpret Louise's cause of death as the joy that kills? So I really just want you to answer these questions and let me see if you understood some of the levels of irony that are apparent in this story. Our next lecture will be on Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants. So to prepare for this discussion, I'd like you to read the story. You might have to read it more than once in order to pick up the subtle details of the dialogue between the two main characters. But I want you to figure out what is causing the tension or conflict between this young couple. So there'll be two characters, Jig and the American is going to allude to an awfully simple operation. So I want you to figure out what he is actually talking about. It would also be helpful if you did a Google search of the idiom, the phrase white elephant, and find a definition for that term.